In the annals of financial history, few names evoke such infamy as Charles Ponzi. Once celebrated as a brilliant investor who could multiply money seemingly overnight, Ponzi commanded respect from thousands who desperately wanted to believe in his miraculous returns. Crowds gathered outside his offices, clutching their life savings, begging for the chance to invest. What they didn't realize was that behind the polished exterior and confident promises lay one of history's most devastating financial frauds. The scheme was so audacious and far-reaching that it forever changed how we understand investment fraud, giving birth to the term Ponzi scheme. Charles Ponzi entered the world on March 3, 1882, in the beautiful Italian countryside. His father worked diligently as a postal worker, providing their family with a comfortable, if modest, existence. However, this simple life stood in stark contrast to their family's glorious past. Ponzi's ancestors had been successful merchants, respected businessmen, and influential public officials who enjoyed wealth and social status. The dramatic fall from prosperity to working-class life created a deep wound in young Charles's psyche. He couldn't accept that his family had lost their fortune and social standing, and this resentment would shape his entire worldview and future actions. From his earliest years, Charles harbored an intense bitterness about his family's reduced circumstances. He constantly wondered why fate had dealt him such an unfair hand. Why should he suffer for his ancestors' financial failures? Why couldn't he have been born into wealth and privilege like the aristocratic families he observed? These questions consumed his thoughts and fueled an obsession with reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. The teenage Ponzi developed grandiose fantasies about living luxuriously without working, convinced that somehow the universe owed him a life of leisure and abundance. This sense of entitlement would prove to be his driving force and ultimate downfall. When tragedy struck and Ponzi's father passed away, the young man inherited a modest sum that his mother hoped would fund his university education. She had dreams of her son becoming a professional, perhaps a lawyer or doctor, someone who could restore the family's respectability. However, Ponzi had entirely different plans for this windfall. Instead of attending classes or studying, he threw himself into an extravagant lifestyle that mimicked the wealthy students around him. He purchased the finest clothing, dined at the most expensive restaurants, attended operas and theater performances, and gambled recklessly at local casinos. To everyone around him, Ponzi appeared to be just another wealthy young man living carelessly off his family's fortune. Ponzi's elaborate charade of wealth couldn't last forever. The inheritance money that seemed endless was actually quite limited, and his extravagant spending quickly depleted every penny. As his funds dwindled, the harsh reality of his situation became impossible to ignore. Not only was he now penniless, but his complete neglect of his studies meant he had no hope of graduating from university. His academic career was in ruins, his future prospects were non-existent, and he had nothing to show for his time except expensive memories and empty pockets. When his uncle offered him honest work as a clerk, Ponzi's pride and sense of superiority made him recoil in disgust at the thought of ordinary employment. Faced with the prospect of working a mundane job or confronting his failures, Ponzi chose what seemed like the easier path: escape. In 1903, he boarded the SS Vancouver bound for Boston, carrying with him nothing but overwhelming shame about disappointing his mother and desperate hopes of somehow striking it rich in America. He convinced himself that the land of opportunity would provide him with the wealth and status he craved. In his mind, he would return to Italy as a triumphant success story, vindicated and wealthy enough to restore his family's honor. The only problem with this grand plan was that Ponzi had absolutely no concrete idea how to achieve these lofty goals in a foreign country. America delivered a brutal awakening to the young Italian immigrant. Gone were the days of living off inherited money or relying on family connections. In this new country, survival depended entirely on his own efforts, and work was no longer optional. Despite his deep disdain for manual labor and his belief that he was destined for greater things, hunger and homelessness forced Ponzi to accept whatever employment he could find. Over the following years, he drifted up and down the eastern seaboard, working as a sign painter, waiter, grocery clerk, dishwasher, factory worker, insurance salesman, and sewing machine repairman. Each job represented a blow to his ego and a reminder of how far he had fallen from his aristocratic dreams. Ponzi's work history revealed a troubling pattern that would plague him throughout his life. He rarely held any position for more than a few months, either quitting in frustration when the work didn't meet his expectations or being fired for attempting to cheat customers and employers. His inability to maintain steady employment often left him destitute, forcing him to steal food or beg for scraps just to survive. Many nights were spent sleeping in parks or homeless shelters. Yet even during these desperate times, whenever Ponzi managed to scrape together a small amount of money, he would inevitably spend it all on a single extravagant night out or weekend vacation, desperate to recapture even a brief taste of the luxurious lifestyle he felt he deserved. By 1907, Ponzi had grown disillusioned with his prospects in the United States and decided to try his luck in Canada. Montreal seemed to offer new possibilities, particularly for Italian immigrants seeking better opportunities than what America provided. His optimism appeared justified when he secured employment as a clerk at Banco Zerossi, a financial institution that primarily served Italian immigrants in the city. This position represented a significant step up from his previous manual labor jobs, and for the first time in years, Ponzi felt like he was moving in the right direction. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was now grateful for the exact type of clerical work he had arrogantly rejected back in Italy, demonstrating how drastically his circumstances and perspective had changed. Ponzi's employment at Banco Zerossi provided him with an unwitting education in financial fraud that would prove invaluable to his future criminal career. His boss, Luigi Zerossi, was operating a sophisticated scam known as robbing Peter to pay Paul. The scheme involved using deposits from new clients to pay artificially high interest rates to existing customers, creating the illusion of legitimate profit while actually running an unsustainable pyramid of debt. Zerossi offered 6% interest rates, double the standard rate, which attracted desperate immigrants hoping to send more money to their families back home. However, complaints began mounting when relatives in Italy reported never receiving the promised funds, and suspicious clients started demanding answers about their investments. When authorities began investigating Banco Zerossi for embezzlement in mid-1908, Luigi Zerossi demonstrated the classic criminal response to impending exposure. He grabbed as much cash as possible and fled to Mexico, abandoning his employees, customers, and even his own family to face the legal consequences of his crimes. This dramatic escape left Ponzi in an extremely precarious position, as he was now associated with a major financial scandal despite being merely a low-level employee. Recognizing the danger of being caught up in the investigation and potentially being charged as an accomplice, Ponzi decided his best option was to return immediately to the United States before the authorities could question him extensively about his role in the fraudulent operation. Before leaving Canada, Ponzi made a decision that would haunt him for years to come. Unwilling to return to America empty-handed and face the prospect of starting over with nothing once again, he devised what he thought was a clever plan to give himself a financial head start. Ponzi forged a check from the Canadian Warehousing Company, one of the bank's clients, for $423.58, an amount he calculated would seem reasonable and unlikely to raise suspicions. However, his criminal inexperience showed immediately when he attempted to cash the fraudulent check at a local bank. The teller quickly identified the forged signature and alerted the police, leading to Ponzi's arrest and subsequent 3-year sentence at St. Vincent, Delaware Paul Penitentiary. After serving 2 years of his sentence, Ponzi was released on parole and immediately began planning his return to the United States. However, instead of learning from his mistakes, he saw an opportunity to make quick money through another illegal scheme. Ponzi agreed to smuggle 5 Italian immigrants across the border into America, men who lacked proper documentation and were willing to pay handsomely for safe passage. This human trafficking operation seemed like easy money to Ponzi, who believed his experience crossing borders would make him an effective smuggler. Unfortunately for him, the authorities were well aware of such operations, and he was caught red-handed with the illegal immigrants, leading to another arrest and the prospect of additional prison time. When Ponzi appeared before the judge for his human smuggling charges, he naively hoped that pleading guilty would earn him leniency, perhaps just a fine that would allow him to continue with his life. Instead, the judge delivered a devastating blow, another 2 years in federal prison, this time in Atlanta. This second incarceration was particularly crushing because it meant Ponzi had now spent 4 of his adult years behind bars, with little to show for his time in North America except a criminal record and dashed dreams. The harsh reality of his situation was becoming impossible to ignore. His attempts at quick wealth through illegal means had only led to poverty, imprisonment, and an increasingly desperate situation. Upon his release from federal prison, Ponzi found himself at a crossroads. Years of incarceration had given him plenty of time to devise elaborate get-rich-quick schemes, but all of them required capital that he simply didn't possess. With no choice but to return to legitimate employment, he once again wandered from state to state, taking whatever work he could find to survive. Eventually, his travels brought him back to Boston, the same city where he had first arrived in America over a decade earlier. There, he secured a position as a clerk with J.R. Poole Company, an import-export business that offered him steady employment and a chance to demonstrate that he could hold down a legitimate job when circumstances demanded it. Boston proved to be the site of a major turning point in Ponzi's life when he met Rose Necco, a beautiful 21-year-old woman who would change everything for him. From the moment they first spoke, Ponzi was completely smitten, though his nervousness made it difficult for him to even carry on a coherent conversation. Fortunately, Rose found his awkward charm endearing, and their courtship quickly developed into a deep mutual affection. They married in early 1918, and for the first time in his adult life, Ponzi experienced genuine happiness and contentment. His new wife brought stability and joy to his chaotic existence, giving him a reason to pursue legitimate success rather than criminal shortcuts to wealth. Despite his newfound happiness with Rose, Ponzi couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing her as a husband. While she seemed perfectly content with their modest lifestyle, he was tormented by his inability to provide her with the luxuries he believed she deserved. In his mind, Rose should be adorned with diamond jewelry, dressed in the finest clothing, and taken on exotic vacations around the world. His clerk's salary at J.R. Poole Company, while sufficient for basic needs, could never fund such extravagances. After 6 months of marriage, the gap between his dreams and reality became unbearable, leading him to make the fateful decision to quit his stable job and pursue something that could make him wealthy enough to shower Rose with all the riches he imagined she deserved. Ponzi's first post-marriage business venture involved joining his father-in-law's wholesale fruit company, which was struggling financially and desperately needed help. Having spent years boasting to Rose about his supposed financial genius and business acumen, this seemed like the perfect opportunity to prove his worth to his new family. He threw himself into the work with enthusiasm, confident that his expertise would quickly turn the failing business around and establish him as the family's savior. However, reality proved far different from his expectations. Despite his best efforts and grand claims about his business skills, Ponzi was unable to reverse the company's fortunes. By the end of the year, the business had declared bankruptcy, leaving everyone involved worse off than before. Undeterred by his recent failure with the fruit business, Ponzi remained convinced that he simply needed the right opportunity to showcase his talents. He rented a modest office space and launched his own import-export company, certain that his years of experience working in the industry had given him the knowledge and connections necessary for success. However, the harsh reality was that Ponzi lacked both the business relationships and the experience needed to attract serious clients. Potential customers showed no interest in his services, and the few inquiries he received never developed into actual business. As weeks turned into months with no significant revenue, it became clear that his import-export venture was heading toward the same fate as his previous attempts at legitimate business success. When Ponzi calculated the enormous costs of advertising his import-export services, a new idea began forming in his mind. If companies were willing to pay such substantial sums for advertising space, perhaps he should be on the receiving end of those payments rather than paying them out. This realization led to his next business concept, creating his own trade publication that would attract advertising revenue from companies seeking to reach potential customers. He envisioned calling his magazine The Trader's Guide and distributing it free to 100,000 companies initially, with plans to double the circulation with each subsequent issue. In Ponzi's optimistic calculations, his initial mailing would cost around $35,000 but generate $80,000 in advertising revenue, creating an instant profit of $45,000. Convinced that The Trader's Guide would be his pathway to fortune, Ponzi made significant investments in the venture. He rented a much larger office space to accommodate his growing operation and hired 3 full-time staff members to help with production and distribution. He spent countless hours writing promotional letters to potential investors and advertisers, painting a picture of incredible success and profitability. However, his confidence proved to be entirely misplaced. The business community showed no interest in his obscure trade publication, and companies certainly weren't willing to pay his inflated advertising rates for a magazine with no established readership or reputation. When Ponzi approached his local bank for a loan to keep the venture afloat, the bank president was so unimpressed that he refused the application immediately and suggested closing Ponzi's account entirely. In August 1919, while sorting through his dwindling correspondence, Ponzi discovered a letter that would change his life forever. The envelope bore Spanish postage and contained a response from one of the many foreign companies he had contacted during his overly optimistic plans to expand the Trader's Guide internationally. The Spanish businessman was requesting a copy of the publication and had included something Ponzi had never encountered before: an international reply coupon, or IRC. These prepaid coupons were designed to facilitate international correspondence by allowing recipients to exchange them for postage stamps in any country that belonged to the Universal Postal Union. For most people, IRCs were simply a practical tool for international mail, but for Ponzi, they represented a spark of inspiration that would lead to both his greatest triumph and his ultimate downfall. Years earlier, during his various attempts at legitimate business, Ponzi had learned about arbitrage, the practice of buying and selling identical assets in different markets to profit from price discrepancies. As he examined the international reply coupon from Spain, he realized that while these coupons could always be exchanged for the same postage value regardless of location, their purchase prices varied slightly due to currency fluctuations between countries. The war had severely weakened the Italian lira, making IRCs cheaper to buy in Italy than their equivalent value when redeemed for American postage stamps. Theoretically, Ponzi could purchase IRCs in bulk from Italy, ship them to America, exchange them for stamps, sell those stamps, and pocket the difference. On paper, this seemed like a perfectly legal arbitrage opportunity that could generate substantial profits. In January 1920, energized by what he believed was his most promising business idea yet, Ponzi established the Securities Exchange Company to handle his international reply coupon arbitrage operation. Unlike his previous failed ventures, this concept seemed to be built on solid financial principles that had been used successfully for centuries. Arbitrage was a legitimate investment strategy employed by sophisticated traders worldwide, and Ponzi convinced himself that he had discovered an overlooked opportunity in the postal system that could make him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. He began developing plans for a global network of agents who would purchase IRCs in countries with weak currencies and ship them to locations where they could be redeemed for higher values, creating a money-making machine that seemed almost too good to be true. As Ponzi delved deeper into the practical aspects of his IRC arbitrage scheme, harsh reality began to intrude upon his optimistic projections. The profit margins he had calculated so enthusiastically proved to be largely theoretical, as they failed to account for the substantial costs of international shipping, currency exchange fees, and the time required to complete each transaction cycle. More devastating was his discovery that there simply weren't enough international reply coupons in existence worldwide to support the kind of large-scale operation he had envisioned. The entire global supply of IRCs was insufficient to generate the millions of dollars in profits he had been counting on. Any reasonable person would have abandoned the idea at this point, but Ponzi had invested too much hope and pride in this venture to let it go. Rather than admit defeat and abandon his IRC concept, Ponzi made a fateful decision that would transform him from a failed businessman into one of history's most notorious criminals. If the actual arbitrage operation couldn't generate the profits he had promised, he would simply pretend that it could. The IRC story sounded sophisticated and plausible to people unfamiliar with international finance, making it the perfect cover for a different kind of operation entirely. Ponzi decided to use the classic rob Peter to pay Paul fraud he had witnessed at Banco Zerossi, taking money from new investors and using it to pay earlier investors while keeping the majority for himself. This scheme allowed him to offer incredible returns: 50% profit in 45 days or 100% in 90 days, that seemed to validate his claims about the IRC arbitrage opportunity. Ponzi understood that sophisticated investors and financial institutions would immediately recognize his promises as impossible, so he deliberately targeted a different demographic: ordinary people with limited financial knowledge who were desperate for quick wealth. These were individuals much like his former self, people with big dreams but little understanding of how investments actually worked. He presented himself as reluctantly sharing his secret to success, claiming he didn't need their money but was willing to help them achieve financial freedom. This reverse psychology approach made potential investors feel like they were being granted access to an exclusive opportunity rather than being sold something. Ponzi's natural charm and apparent reluctance to take their money made his pitch incredibly effective with people who wanted to believe in miracle investments. Starting with neighbors and acquaintances in his own community, Ponzi's scheme began modestly with just 18 investors in his first month of operation. However, when these early investors received their promised returns exactly as scheduled, word spread like wildfire throughout Boston's immigrant communities. Soon, thousands of people were crowding the streets outside his office, clutching their life savings and desperate to invest in what appeared to be a legitimate miracle. At the height of his operation, Ponzi was collecting over $250,000 per day, an astronomical sum in 1920. The Boston Post newspaper wrote glowing articles about him, calling him a financial genius and inadvertently providing him with the credibility that attracted even more investors to his fraudulent scheme. For the first time in his life, Ponzi was able to live exactly as he had always dreamed. He purchased a magnificent mansion, drove expensive automobiles, wore custom-tailored clothing, and adorned himself with gold watches and diamond accessories. He and Rose traveled first class to exotic destinations, dining at the finest restaurants and staying in luxury hotels. Every material possession he had ever coveted was now within his reach, and he spared no expense in creating the lifestyle he felt he had always deserved. However, this period of seemingly unlimited wealth and luxury would prove to be tragically brief, as the fundamental impossibility of his promises meant that his elaborate house of cards was destined to collapse spectacularly. By summer 1920, less than 6 months after launching his scheme, cracks began appearing in Ponzi's carefully constructed facade. The same Boston Post that had once praised him as a genius began investigating his operation, bringing in Clarence Barron, president of Dow Jones, who quickly exposed the mathematical impossibility of Ponzi's claims. Barron calculated that Ponzi would need 160 million international reply coupons to meet his obligations, while only 27,000 existed worldwide. When this analysis appeared on the newspaper's front page, it triggered a government investigation that Ponzi couldn't deflect with charm and evasion. His own publicist, William McMasters, discovered the truth and wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning exposé that finally brought down the entire operation. The collapse ruined thousands of investors, destroyed several banks, and sent Ponzi to federal prison, ending one of history's most audacious financial frauds and creating a cautionary tale that continues to warn investors about schemes that promise impossible returns.